Cool. So we're just starting off by saying time, date, where we are. I'll just say this is the Rowland Howard Autoluminescent interview with Jeremy Gluck. We'll just get you there. So, can you tell us where we are, time and day, or not time, day and date later?
October 24th, 2010, Cafe Jazz, Cardiff.
Cardiff. And you are?
Jeremy Gluck.
Good. Happy? Okay. So can you just go back to the very beginning? Like, how did you start first? Where did you come from? How did you first start getting involved in music or interested in music?
I suppose my older brother, David, who's 7 years my senior, was my mentor in this regard, who was a child of the 60s. And then an adult of the 70s and 80s and subsequently. A big influence on me in terms of my musical taste, which did tend towards the, at that time, marginal end of the spectrum, like, you know, whatever, anything from the Stooges and all this sort of stuff, and garage punk and so on, when I was growing up in Canada.
What year was that?
Say early 70s. I was at high school then in Ottawa, Canada's capital. Lovely city. I was always obsessed with Great Britain for reasons probably to do with destiny, if you believe in destiny. From about 12, anything British I was interested in and quite obsessive about. And decided very early on I was going to come to London and do things in London. I just knew I had to go to London. So that was when I was about 12. The means then appeared in the form of a relative dying, leaving me a modest inheritance. And I went to London ostensibly for 2 weeks and stayed 2 months and trashed the rest of my big planned European tour. I just wanted to be in London because it was so fantastic. My dream had come true because I'd seen my brother live through the 60s and he'd experienced the 60s, and I was like, that's it, I've blown it. I mean, you know, I always knew in Ottawa when I was younger, if anything else happened like that, I wasn't going to miss it, I was going to blow it. That's why I ran to London, and my friends said to me, you know, what are you going to London for? Go to Toronto, go to New York. But I was thinking, and I wanted to start a band, and I was saying, well, yeah, but if you know, you can do anything in Toronto. It's like small, you know, big fish in a small pond. And if you go to London, you get like, you know, any attention. It's more substantial. So I went to London. I totally fell in love with London. In fact, it was the first place I ever really felt at home in. I loved the old world. I loved the damp. I loved everything else that caused minor disease and derangement about London. It's wonderful, you know, and it was things more than 200 years old, apart from Indians. Or they looked like they're 200 years old, mostly due to alcoholism in Ottawa.
What era was that? What year?
77, you see, it was prime time, the spring of 77, the Jubilee. I was there in the heat of the summer of 77, going to see all these bands, including the Saints, incidentally, playing the remarkable farewell gig at the Marquee, things like that. And I came.
What other bands do you remember?
Oh God, I had a little diary I kept lovingly at the time of every band I saw for 6 weeks, 2 or 3 a night sometimes. Everything. I almost saw the Pistols in Sweden, but I missed them by a couple of days, which is a shame. But everyone who I wanted to see, I saw, barring the Clash, who I saw later. Just loads of punk bands. Some, like Generation X, were heroes of mine. Some became famous later, like Susie and the Banshees. Some I discovered pretty much in London, like the Saints. I mean, I had I'm Stranded when I was in Ottawa even, but I never really thought much about it. I met the Saints the first time I went to London. I was already writing for fanzines at that point in the States and Canada. So I remember interviewing them in their squalid hotel. That was quite funny, extremely squalid. In fact, I woke them up. I was always a bit too keen. And then I thought it was like 6 or 8 magical weeks. It was 2 weeks in Europe and 6 weeks in London. Fantastic. I made loads of contacts, and I met this fellow Robin Wills, who subsequently formed the band I was in, the Barracudas, when I went back about a year later. Once again, destiny, really. He wrote me a letter saying, we were exchanging letters, quaintly, now it seemed. And I said, he said, oh, I have a new band, maybe you want to come and sing a song. And I said, no, I want to come and join the band, be the singer. And he was like, okay. He's a psychopath, just humor him. He was quite wise, really. So I got to take it, quit my job, my beloved real estate job, and went to London and formed my band. And then I began to see a lot of amazing bands and also got into playing myself. I almost as soon as I arrived again, it happened. In Wardour Street Market, I met Dennis Tech, the Dennis Tech. I mean, you know, one of the greatest guitarists in history. And all these wonderful things happened, you know, and formed my band. We became modestly successful. In an unlikely twist of fate, we went from being a kind of semi-comical band that endeared itself to the journalist to being signed to EMI, which, the classic story about that was I wrote my brother a letter saying I've been signed to EMI, but he didn't realize it was true till I sent him a single on EMI. He thought I was making a joke at his expense. It was such an incredible thing to do. I mean, I was like a schlep from high school in Ottawa, and 18 months later I signed EMI. So it can happen. Whether you want it to happen is a different story we won't go into here. But we had a great time. I made some really good stuff. We became somewhat beloved of the Europeans, never in Britain really.
Do you have any theories over what Britain at that time?
Yeah, I do actually. I mean, the interesting thing was two things possibly. They may sound a bit lateral, but when I arrived in Britain, I realized two very important things. One, that Monty Python was a documentary about Britain, not actually a exaggeration of some of its comical aspects. There was people at bus stops saying, "They're ruining the neighborhood," and all. I mean, it was genuinely at that time quite true to the country, the mentality and everything. And the Clockwork Orange also, similarly, was quite accurate. As I wandered the housing estates of South London covered in hideous graffiti and reeking of urine, I thought, this is also a documentary. Put those two things together, you could have an explosion of some kind, especially young people. And it was also, then, it's hard to think of it now. London's become very different now, especially, and Britain in many ways. It's much more affluent, it's much more cosmopolitan. It was much still post-war. I mean, one of the first experiences I had in London was when we were rehearsing in some house near Edgware Road. And some woman walked up to me in a kind of daze and just pointed at this vacant lot and said, "Oh, my house was there. It was blown up in the Blitz." And I was like, I thought, being a colonial, cool, but I sounded very sympathetic, you know. But I mean, it wasn't that long since the war even. It was only 30 years. I mean, all these kind of tensions. And it was the shift from Labour to Conservative tendencies. I think a lot of things, and the music also had become incredibly dull. But I don't know if it was so much about music, just about, this was its time, I think. People were fed up with the status quo, and literally and figuratively, I suppose, with status quo. And they wanted something to call their own. The inheritance of the kind of post-war generation, which was even in the music in a way, was still there. I mean, the Beatles even, say, or the Stones, were still a post-war kind of phenomenon in a strange way, almost existentially, whereas things like the Pistols suggested something futuristic. Although, of course, we see now it wasn't so much so. But, I don't know, when I went back and re-examined a lot of the music of that time recently, I was amazed, even by people like Generation X, who were kind of a disposable pop band in the opinion of the hardcore punk fans of the day, were very political and kind of aware and trying to bring up issues in their own clumsy way. Well, certainly now, it's a very different environment. It makes it look revolutionary compared to what's happening now, where X Factor is pretty much the level of revolution, which I watched last night for my sins and isn't going to change anything, I'm sorry to say.
So what do you, I mean, you arrived right on the punk explosion.
Yes.
You must have known what the state of music was like before the punk thing. I mean, do you think, did that have any impact? What do you think of the state of music pre-punk in England?
Well, I think generally, see, the thing with me is, at the time it wouldn't have been fashionable to say it, but now, of course, we've realized the early 70s were a fantastic time for music. Well, the bands like the MC5 and the Stooges and the Dolls came from the early 70s. They were actually pre-punk bands, obviously, who formed the whole sort of thing. And even Suicide were already active, who I think were one of the great revolutionary bands, visionaries. Yeah, I think to me the early 70s was full of fantastic music, but there was a kind of sensibility which was very staid and kind of mediocre in some ways. I mean, some music that was popular, like progressive rock, I still to this day find almost obnoxious, and I can't handle it all. So I like them, but yet things like Alice Cooper, some of the greatest rock music ever, and it was highly commercially successful. So it begs the question. I mean, I think now I would have to say it was some of the greatest music ever made, and it's the music I listen to most of the time. I'm not ashamed to say. On my binges, like listening to Who's Next for 6 months at a time. I don't listen to Anarchy in the UK very often. I listen to The Clash, say, a lot. But most punk-era punk music I rarely listen to. It's even the earlier stuff that was my initial love affair with music that really stamped me, like a lot of people. But I think the ingredients were there, probably in that pilgrimage Malcolm McLaren made to New York. It was all there in a way. That was the crucible. I think John Savage and everyone else is right about that. that was probably the trigger. He understood something was possible because of his British sensibility the Americans didn't get, which is why they had new wave and not punk rock. New wave was like the kind of soap opera version of punk rock, obviously, you know. Whereas the British, they wanted something that was kind of like, you know, we're suffering, we're complaining. Well, what else is new? But when they do it right, no one does it better. Yeah. Whereas in LA, they had punk bands. They were all kind of like, they were brilliant, like the Dills and the Weirdos, who I love. But it was never really going to play anywhere else, or even much in LA, because the American sensibility is just too radically different. Yeah. So it had to happen in Britain, and I'm glad it did. The music's fantastic that came from it. But it also died out very quickly. By the time I arrived in '78, it was already entering as kind of a post-punk sort of environment, and the Jam and people like that were rising with much more mainstream sounding singles, which is fine. But you can't play White Riot forever without there being an actual riot. I think there was one. There's not a lot of riots. You know, you have to have more than one riot to really have a revolution, gentlemen. A riot and a record deal, not bad, but it's not the same thing.
So, the birthday party headed over here about end of '79, like 1980. What do you think? What was happening to the local music scene then?
That was the pre-Smiths environment. Now, I didn't listen to the Smiths much at the time when they came out. I've realized since, in my opinion, they're probably the greatest British band since the Beatles. In that weird, uneasy gap between punk, which was about 12 hours, it seemed like 12 hours. Probably all the best singles would last about 12 hours. You know, 12 months in duration, all that really happened. Then it got very quiet, like in a war movie, but it's quiet, too quiet. It got too quiet. There was a lot of crap bands around, not to put too fine a point on it. The New Romantics appeared from somewhere, some laboratory that should have been locked. And I think there was this restlessness again for something exciting. I mean, there was a lot of power pop type things, like the Vapors came and went. They were fine. And, you know, Video Killed a Radio Star, which actually was quite a visionary single, if also incredibly annoying. And there was some stirrings, but nothing exciting. It was kind of like, punk's over, it's going all too soon. And the punks were all kind of like, you know, better go to the job center and go on a retraining scheme. So we could become the music lawyers of the next generation, which many did probably. And it was kind of gap. And there was some great people passing through. There's a lot of good American stuff then, like roots stuff. There's some people like the Blasters and stuff were coming up, wonderful music. But it was very niche. You'd go and see them, be 100 people who all had their album, mostly journalists, because you know, they were the ones who knew about them. And then we'd all go home and think, you know. And then with the birthday party, I think, I mean, I don't know if they didn't do it consciously, but they picked a good time because they had that wonderful combination of rock and roll bands that are great, where they had the abuse of suicide, which I witnessed, the wonder of Alan Vega, like it's abusing people verbally in a way that I frankly, as a front man myself, have often envied and tried to emulate, because nothing's more satisfying in many ways than abusing an audience, especially one that likes you. It's just one of those funny things to do with being on stage. You'd like to think that saying, I love you, you're beautiful is great, but actually saying the opposite is somehow more satisfying. It's all very psychological. They had that. And they also had this phenomenal power, you know, I mean, and it was genuine. That's the thing about the birthday party that really struck you. They were actually quite sinister as well. They were quite, I mean, now you'd sort of think, it actually hurts to say you think they're goths. But that's when they weren't really any goths. It was The Cure, who I can't abide personally, that's just my opinion. You know, but I was just, something about the birthday party, they had that thing Birdman had, but Birdman never made it. And Australians bands have, which I wrote about at one stage, and fascinated me. So they were in isolation. By the time the Saints came and I saw them, that was a band that hadn't been tainted by playing in London for years and having everyone see them already and everyone talk about them already. The birthday party had that huge advantage. They were a surprise. I mean, it goes without saying with their name. They were a surprise birthday party. I mean, the first time I saw them, I can't say nothing could have prepared me for them because I'd seen people like Iggy Pop, you know, sort of whom Nick Cave's something of an understudy. But nevertheless, and you know, speaking of Rowland in his rather peculiar raincoat, and Tracy, bless him, R.I.P. also in his Stetson, and then, you know, the whole shtick going on, and Nick behaving in frankly peculiar fashion, ranting and raving and stuff. It's kind of like, you know, Nick Cave at that time, probably even now, but he's kind of, well, he's become like a literati star, but then he really was like a kind of a teen pinup for teens of another planet, you know, which is fantastic. He had all these girls going crazy. They didn't even know why. You're not meant to go crazy for someone like that, unless you're the girl's parents and you want to kill him or something different. And they came on, and I remember just thinking, this is great. They're like the Stooges, but they're not the Stooges. And having never seen the Stooges, they'll do. So I was thrilled. And they also had a guitarist as good as James Williamson. You don't find that every day. Let's be honest. I mean, apart from anything else, James Williamson, you know, is an incredible guitarist. Well, so was Rowland, incredible. And they were just really quite bizarre. I just remember thinking, yeah, I was told by this friend of mine, they're doing press for them at the time, go and see this band, they were going to really amaze you, you know. I went and saw them over and over again, and I saw some of their most famous early London gigs over about 2 years, and they never disappointed me. I kind of lost interest when they started getting fancy on mute, but that's just me, you know, I'm a dilettante. But I mean, the core stuff, Prayers on Fire is a classic, so was Junkyard, you know, and they were just phenomenal. They were very, very, very powerful and exciting, and the sound they made was horrendous. I mean, it was kind of like Suicide without synthesizers, which is kind of a dream in a funny sort of way, you know, if you have an aversion to that sort of stuff. And yeah, I can still see them in my mind's eye. They're pretty out there, and the audiences were alternately absolutely enthralled and worshipful and just horrified, which is like when I saw, like the sign of a great band, like when I saw in Vega, like, you know, half the audience is like, this is disgraceful, and the other half is like absolutely in love with them. And the great thing is he exploits that, which is what the birthday party did. They could realize they were having this horror love affair with the audience. And they were somewhat surreal in London because it was so drab. It was like, where do you want to go and see some sort of average British band now when you can go and see them? You know? And I mean, maybe he was the anti-Morrissey. I never thought of it before, but in a strange, almost hideous way, it could be true. The fancy lyrics, the good looks, and all this stuff, you know. But he was unpleasant for a while.
Do you remember?
The funny thing with the birthday party, I mean, because I also wrote at the time as a sideline to being a musician for a living, I interviewed them twice for my sins as well very early on. And it was very funny. I mean, I have the interviews stashed away. And they were charming, of course. I remember saying in the interview, this is the birthday party, these nasty, unpleasant people. I mean, Nick said a wonderful thing at the end of the first interview. He goes, oh yeah, I said, you know, what about your mother? What does she think? He goes, I go home and I have coffee over breakfast and talk about things. Like, oh, bless. Nick Cave's mother, I'm home, you know. And what more do you want? What a legend. So yeah, the first time I saw them, I think it was some really crappy little place like the Moonlight Club. And I do remember Rowland really clearly. I mean, obviously I'm a bit cued by the interview, but in his legendary, you know, raincoat with a pointy collar and the studied cigarette, and the jazz master, which, I mean, apart from anything else, anyone who plays it like a 50s jazz master, if you're a musician of any kind, I don't even play guitar, even I know it's a great guitar. That's how good it is. He's got a jazz master, you know. And they all look so cool. And my band was notorious in London for, people loved us, but we weren't cool. We were cool in France. It's a different story. Possibly because the French have more taste, but we won't go there right now. And I was like, these guys are really cool, and they scare people, which is something I really aspired to, you know. Never quite managed most of the time. I think I annoyed people a lot. It's not the same thing. And they were really scary and kind of intense, you know. I mean, it was in a very, I mean, I have to say about the birthday party, much as I love and loved them, I can't always like talk with this kind of like awe that they were, because, you know, I've been around a few times. I mean, a lot of it was very studied and kind of, you know, Nick Cave's thing. Of course, yeah, a lot of it was out of control and it was crazy and we take drugs. But, I mean, it was also kind of like, have you noticed we're crazy and out of control, we take drugs? You notice we take drugs? Good. And we're crazy? Yeah, got that. Yes, okay. So that was all really good, you know. But it was lovable. Because like also, like any great band, they were like a cartoon as well, but a very strange cartoon. Now it would be like a manga thing. Then there was not really any place for it, you know? There wasn't really a cartoon style yet to do them justice. But they were. Nick Cave would be ranting and raving and intimidating people, and they loved it. I thought, yeah, they were a class act. I mean, their early music I did think was phenomenally original, even though you could see its influences very clearly, especially King Ink. I was obsessed with that for a while. I thought, And the literary lyrics, which then tired me out eventually. I mean, Nick Cave's vocabulary is fantastic, but he doesn't have to use all of it in every song. I mean, you know, it's okay. I mean, you can have, you know, yummy, yummy, goody, goody, and chewy, chewy, which I consider the trinity of lyrics, you know. Going beyond that, always risky in popular music. But it was phenomenal, you know. He had quite a command of the written word, and there was obviously a lot more going on. I can see why very soon he tired of the birthday party and took off and did something more true to himself, which I never related to as much because it didn't have the same racket chaotic quality. And they were chaotic. And of course, I think the drugs were a big part of it. But, you know, that's been going on a long time. I mean, watch Gimme Shelter, the Stones and Gimme Shelter. Maybe the difference is, I think, they wouldn't have been as scared as the Stones were at Altamont. Maybe. But he's so scared. Mick Jagger looks like he's wetting himself. Keith Richards like, another day, another dollar. But yeah, Mick Jagger looks a bit worried. But I think, yeah.
You could feel. Oh, sorry. You could feel.
Well, the thing was, you knew they were on heroin because they kind of like, you know, in their photos, the famous photos of Rowland and Nick, like nodding off on each other. It was kind of like, unless you just thought that, you know, they suffered from narcolepsy and you were very naive, which would have been a nice take on it. I think, you know, if you had a kind of a mother-in-law's, oh look, falling asleep, you know. But no, obviously they were on heroin. But to someone like me, who frankly, I mean, about the time they started taking a lot of drugs, I stopped. So I found it all a bit de rigueur, and I just thought, good heavens, you know, shouldn't you be putting that in a trust fund or something for your children? But yeah, the drug thing was great. It doesn't contribute anything to music usually. It can. I mean, it can, with the Stones it has. And probably it did with them, come to think of it, and the Gun Club. When they actually obviously did the Stooges, obviously. But to me, it wouldn't be a big deal because it's kind of like an option. But if your music stinks, it's going to stink on heroin too.
But it's sort of, I mean, I don't know if you probably heard back the original Boys Next Door or what they were before, and where they, you know, they weren't really full on with the drugs then, but it did seem like the drugs were heading them into a wild, sort of animistic place as against their new romantic sort of beginnings, really.
Well, I think new romantic. Yeah.
Well, if you see that, have you ever seen that first Shivers?
Yeah, I think.
All that makeup and
I know what you're saying, completely. I mean, I think what you just said actually just made me realize, and maybe it was coming to Britain, I think, probably, more than the drugs, because they were cut loose from this isolated margin, you know, fishbowl kind of thing, like me when I came from Canada, except I had, well, you know, the drug thing, but a different sort of journey. But certainly in their case, it was probably a huge expansion. Like, it's like, you know, a space-time thing. They suddenly start expanding exponentially. Their music did, probably their self-esteem did as artists because they got so much attention. The possibilities were endless. Suddenly they were getting offers from big labels. Everyone wanted a piece of them. They had a lot of credibility. I don't know how well they handled it. I'm reminded actually of a very, very, very good Mick Jagger anecdote where someone said to him after some period, saying, oh, you know, when they were interviewing with Brian Jones, and you know, Tracy Pugh died and stuff at that time. There's no direct analogy, by the way, but they said to him, you know, what about Brian Jones? And he was very reluctant and kind of he didn't want to say anything. I said, well, you know, don't you feel bad about it? He said, look, you know, if you give someone who's young incredible fame and success and money and women and everything they want, you either become a prick or you die. And I thought that's very true. You know, I'm not saying that happened at the birthday party, but in a way there's a very rough kind of, I mean, I think they had to do, you know, you have to deal with it in some way. And I think they probably enjoyed it. That's the thing about drugs. If you enjoy it that much, you're going to do them. I'm a different kind of person. I didn't enjoy them that much, so I stopped very early on. In their case, it obviously became something of a love affair, and didn't do anyone any favors in the long term. Most of the people I've known who were involved in them, including Rowland, bless him, has to be said. But these are the choices we make. But yeah, I'm sure the drugs were a big part of their life. I know they were, even much later on, when I knew Rowland later, actually knew him later musically, and he was still very much involved in all that. But to me, at that point, it had really become something I didn't relate to. But in their case, yeah, it was probably indispensable. And I'm sure it was part of their image as well. There were fantastic photos Blood and Butcher took of them nodding off. I mean, you think, wow, that's decadent. Of course it's decadent. It's rock and roll. You know, what do you want? It's like there's that very famous picture of Keith Richards in the astronaut's suit in the airport, and he's obviously out to lunch. That's what a way to be remembered. Rather that or doing a crochet. I mean, you know.
I mean, I think, especially in Australia at that time, or before at that time.
Well, the Birdman had that thing with the Stooges too. We were playing with Ron Ashton later and stuff in the case of Dennis Tech. Well, the Stooges were the template for the ultimate post-Stones rebel band, weren't they? And it was very much involved, and their best music was done in heroin. Raw power. Well, actually all of it was probably on drugs, a lot of them. Iggy's very, I mean, how he got out of it all is a miracle, really, and he's to his credit in some ways, or he'd probably be dead long ago. And musically, it might have been a good thing. That's a terrible thing to say, but as a human being, I'm glad he's still around. doing insurance ads in Britain, it has to be said, but that's why.
Do you think also, I mean, being Australian, probably similar to you as a Canadian, the charge of being from another side of the planet, or that where you are feeling isolated from the music, punk music scene, or whatever's hip, is that part of what helped make them this splash?
Yeah, I'd say basically yes. I mean, it's a huge buzz and it translates because other people pick it up. I mean, they were new in town, they were an unknown quantity. The people who knew about them wanted very much to give them attention because they were exciting and interesting, dream for journalists. And that whole sort of like, we're irreverent, this and that. Although curiously, the 2 times I interviewed them, they were incredibly polite and intelligent and well-spoken and considered. So it just goes to show,
They are very nice,
they are lovely people.
Boys,
Yeah, I mean, Rowland was a lovely guy, obviously, lovely,
Oh yeah, Rowland's almost like an aristocrat.
Yeah, he was like, that's why, this is one of the reasons I shouldn't jump ahead, why Nikki Sudden loved him, because Nikki was obsessed with 19th century Britain and 18th century Britain, like colonial Britain, and wrote about it all the time and liked to dress like a dandy and read all these old books and stuff. He had a huge collection of antiquarian books of the time. And of course, Rowland was like that with his cravats and everything, and it's kind of like, the cigarette held just so and everything. It was fantastic. It was really fantastic. I mean, that didn't emerge till a bit later. That wasn't on stage in the early birthday party. He just seemed like a very strange looking and strange acting person. He hardly moved. So it was kind of intriguing when Nick was thrashing around. And he would just he had this gift where he was like playing the most extraordinary things, seemingly effortlessly. And he was so young as well at that time.
What do you think was so distinctive about his guitar playing?
What just leapt into my mind, it was actually frightening. I mean, it was just, for the skill he had at his age. He was had a virtuoso skill already when I saw him. He must have only been in his 20s, early probably. Intuition, which is like a great musician of any kind, artist. I mean, just is intuitive. Like when I saw him do overdubs when I was recording with him years later, that's what astounded me. Like he said to me after he did one sort of run through on something and said, "What do you think I should play?" I mean, what am I going to say? To Roland Howard, but what to play? How would I describe it anyway? So just do whatever you like. And then he did another take. It was just astounding, just like off the wall. And he was, "Is that okay?" I went, Because I knew it was unique. He wasn't going to do it again the same way twice. But why ask? I mean, what's the point? It was perfect. I think he obviously. I mean, it's like all these things. I'm reminded of a great Burroughs thing. I mean. People talk about the great revolutionary of the written word and everything. Well, obviously, when you study Burroughs, you realize he knew the classics back to front. So it doesn't come from nowhere. And of course, Rowland knew the blues back to front. He knew the Stooges back to front. He knew this and that back to front in great depth, and he obviously loved it. I mean, he had a much greater knowledge of, say, of the blues than I would ever have, and love of it. And I think jazz, too, he must have known quite. I don't know much about his influences, but probably a fair bit, because it was such a spontaneity of it, And I don't know, he just had a gift, I think, more than anything else. And he was lucky to be in a band initially where almost anything went in terms of his playing. It was very free form. Now, These Immortal Souls was different. I think it was much more disciplined, and Crime in the City Solution, too. He was more conscious, but it was still brilliant. He didn't lose any of his genius, just a little bit of the spontaneity, but it was a good trade-off.
We interviewed his father, and his father's taste in what they had played in and that was played in the house. His mother was into folk music, and he hated most folk music, but Lee hated it was being played in the house all the time.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, the classical thing I can see. I mean, I wouldn't say it was grandiose, but he had a big sound, a big style. Rowland didn't play fiddly little parts really, or if he did, they were part of something big. So it was kind of symphonic, some of his stuff. It was very intense and big. Even small things would be like, He had incredible skill as a musician. Like when I saw him playing, you actually saw him playing up close. It was really amazing. It was like, wow, his command of what he was doing.
Do you know anything? I'm not a guitarist, but do you know anything technically about what made his sound so unique? I mean, boxes or?
I don't really know. I mean, that sort of sound, I don't know what he used. Maybe other people could tell you. I mean, I think of the Flamin' Groovies in this regard, and their sound, which at their peak was phenomenal when they had their kind of Mersey beat type sound, with a perfect sound, with a Fender this and the Fender that and everything exactly. I think Rowland was very picky too. We had an amazing old vintage guitar, which anyways, with the right kind of setup, is going to sound incredible. I mean, it's a classic Fender guitar. really big, meaty old guitar. It was like very big noise. And he used a lot of, sort of classic old amps and stuff, and I don't think he used a lot of pedals. That's something about Rowland, he didn't need a lot of pedals. I don't remember him using many, if any, when I worked with him at all. I think he just had this way of getting the sounds out of the guitar, which is just using the switches more than anything else, and reverb and just natural sustain and stuff.
And feedback, he liked the feedback.
He loved his feedback. He did some feedback on my stuff that was just wild. I've had guitarists I've worked with since playing the songs they wouldn't even try to emulate it, but just kind of like, can you get in the zone kind of thing. He also got that through playing very, very loud, of course, which was part of it, part of the power. But if it was recorded properly, it was amazing.
Do you, that's coming that way. But just going back, as you saw the birth festival,
Oh my God, I'm so sorry.
That's all right.
Oh.
Okay.
Roll on.
Now where was it? Oh yes. So if you were seeing the birthday party from pretty much similar to their early years in London? Or
81, 82.
As it progressed, it's only a couple of years or so, did you notice a transition? Was it getting...
The truth is that I didn't follow them as closely after Junkyard. By the time they went to Mute, it was becoming a bit too studied for me. And that's not a criticism, but I lost some interest in the sound because it was too mannered at that point. Although I think it was still brilliant. And then I picked up when Rowland started his solo work with Crime and the City Solution and These Immortal Souls later. I followed them. But the later Birthday Party, and then Nick did his first solo album, I just couldn't relate to it then, and I still don't really. I have a great admiration for him as an artist. He's obviously very gifted, just not my taste, which is nothing. But the later Birthday Party, I did see them, I kept on seeing them live. But I guess, of course, obviously, after the initial excitement and impact they made, you get used to anything pretty fast. And I remember interviewing them not long before they went to Mute the second time. And you could already feel that they'd achieved already much more than they ever expected to, which is good, they deserved to, but they were also kind of like, well, I could see, looking back, I can see the band probably wouldn't have that much more mileage because it wasn't a band that was built to last. And obviously Nick was already casting his inner gaze somewhere where he could have complete control artistically to a different kind of sound. What Rowland was thinking, I have no idea. My impression would be that he still felt there was a lot of mileage in it, but that wasn't going to be because once Nick went, I don't know how Rowland felt about that, but obviously it would have been a fair blow in some ways, I should think, one way or another.
Did you get a feeling, like on that point, not meant something that couldn't be sustained for too long?
Who knows? It could have, I guess, if it had gone. I think part of that was the drugs. That's true, quite conceivably, because that can have a determining influence on things like that. It makes people much more unpredictable and headstrong sometimes. I just think that my only take on it would be that Nick had a kind of destiny or intuition before, or of some kind, that he wanted to do something that wouldn't be accommodated forever by the birthday party. And he would have to leave them behind at some stage, whether they liked it or not. And I don't know about the circumstances of that at all. That's my only impression.
There was, in our interview with Nick, that seemed obvious that there was not enough room for two songwriters.
Yeah, I think it emerged later what a phenomenally good songwriter Rowland is as well. I mean, I would have to say personally, I prefer Rowland's music much more, just to my taste. And it is. I actually prefer his voice more, and that's a curious thing. Because I remember when I was with him and Nikki making the album we made together, he'd done this song with Nikki, Don't Explain, a cover of the Billie Holiday, which was my favorite thing he did actually, and with Nikki, who I also loved as a friend too. And I remember Nikki saying, go on, sing. And Rowland was really reluctant to do lead vocals, and Nikki was saying, sing. And I think it was Nikki's encouragement, because Nikki was someone else who people was always saying, get a proper singer and you'll be big. And Nikki being Nikki, bless him. I mean, Nikki, I just wouldn't hear of it. He had to sing his songs. But I think Rowland was a bit insecure initially, but I'm glad he did sing. And by the time we got to things like King of California, that's just fantastic vocal performances. No one else sounds like that, whether you like it or not. I'm not saying it's like, Mike Love, but it's him. And it's a shame he didn't do more, but he didn't do more recorded work, but that's another story. But yeah, I think the songwriter thing, of course, that probably was what was behind it. And I think, Nick might have, who knows, might have felt, we'd never feel threatened, but yeah, it's a lot to carve up especially when you're getting more popular.
I think we said to us that there was only so many songs about Genevieve you could actually sing in your life.
Yeah, that's bands for it. Yeah, I know. Yeah, it's funny. It's well, yeah, it's
But also
well,
Nikki is go out with Genevieve.
well, naturally. I mean, what's a band without incest? I had to sit through a playback of an album where the drummer was having an affair with the guitarist's wife, and they were all sitting there. So I just want to live through that. But for atmosphere. But yeah, I know, of course. Yeah. I mean, I met Genevieve briefly when they were together in London. It was obviously the love of his life, and yeah, they were great on. I saw them live and everything. It worked really well. But yeah, I'm sure that would be a bit annoying if you're having to sing songs all the time about someone else's girlfriend. Tiresome in the extreme, probably.
So when they broke up, you weren't too involved or weren't following them?
I kind of lapsed at that point and went off. I mean, I had my own band that I was doing stuff with, and I was also a journalist and I was doing all kinds of other things. And the thread was really picked up then through Nikki because, I mean, to kind of move on slightly. I mean, my route to Rowland was really through Nikki Sudden, who I knew very early on when the Barracudas started in London. And Swell Maps were on Rough Trade. I used to hang out a lot with Rough Trade, because that's what you did. It was a lovely time. Just hang out. And the Barracudas were hoping Rough Trade would release us. We weren't cool enough for Rough Trade, which is fine in retrospect. But Nikki used to hang out there all the time because the Swell Maps actually were on Rough Trade, and we just hit it off. And we played gigs together sometimes. And over the years, we shared girlfriends and did all those things people do, and planned to write our sort of country and western type songs that we weren't doing with our bands and whatever. And we demoed some songs, and year after year, Nikki would say to me, and I would say, like, let's do this stuff. When we get this together, it just wouldn't happen. I had lost track of Rowland at that point, and the birthday party and all that sort of stuff. I was aware of it all. I mean, Rowland wasn't doing that much. He was actually. He formed Crime in the City Solution. I can get into that. But yeah, through Nikki, I became hooked up with Rowland in a personal way again, much more. And I did these demos with Nikki in 1983. But it wasn't until '87 that he rang, and he was in the studio with Rowland making some of the creation stuff with him, and said, it was one of these calls, like, I mean, at that time, you have to understand, it's quite funny. I mean, Nikki and Rowland were still living the life of rock and roll vagabonds, taking drugs, fast women, and this, that, and the other. And I was living in a nice co-op house in Islington with my wife and first child, and leading a respectable life. And I'd left everything else, like all that stuff behind me, as being somewhat past, beyond the pale now. And this phone rings, it's Nikki. I'm in the studio with Rowland and Epic, and we're making an album. Do you want to do our album now? I'm not going to say, actually, no, I'm busy. I said, yes. And at that, these are days you can't imagine now. It's like, it might as well be a different century. I picked up the phone to some independent label, and I said, that I run by a French person, bless the French. And I said, who'd released Nikki's first album, Frenchie on Flick Knife, character. And I said, Nikki and Rowland are making an album in Woodworm, Dave Pegg's studio from Fairport Convention. And they want to tag on 7 or 10 days. Okay. And that was it. It was all paid for. Made a classic album. Came home and resumed working and looking after my wife and child. So, but to backtrack slightly, yeah, the Crime in the City Solution. I saw their first gig at the Electric Cinema in Portobello. That was stunning. They were great, great, great. I remember I still have the review I wrote of them. They were really, I mean, much more to my taste than the Late Birthday Party, and certainly, I mean, I listened to From Her to Eternity, and I thought, okay, but I don't know. I got the Carpenters for this, and frankly, the vocals are better, so that's what I listened to. Goodbye to Love, Forgive Me, and things like that. But Crime, they were great, and Epic was a great drummer. I mean, Rowland was smart to pick up Epic, and I know they were very close. He was an amazing drummer. He was like Rowland on guitar. There was no one else like him. No one ever played drums like Epic except Epic, and he was singular, powerful, but incredibly original, very jazz influenced again, very off the wall. And they were phenomenal. They were great. They should have been much bigger. I mean, but what can you do? And they made some classic stuff, which is being rediscovered thanks to piracy. Thank God for piracy. What would have been lost without it? And but they never really went anywhere. But because it was Rowland, it was phenomenal. They were great. And it was like, once again, a bunch of critics and their friends going, great band, and then going home. What are you going to do? Go through a moonlight walk through town with placards. I mean, there's the band at the end of the day. And then a few years later, I was in the studio with Rowland, myself, and Epic. So yeah, and then yeah, so Nikki made this call, and I trotted off to Woodworm, not really knowing what to expect. They'd been there for days and days recording. I hadn't seen Rowland for years. And, Rowland and I were not natural buddies. Like Nikki and Rowland were very close, and they toured and they made records together, and also, and they were really close. You know, you could see they really actually loved each other, and that was great. You know, Rowland and I were, Nikki and I were very good friends, very fond of each other. Rowland and I were two people who, like, you know, basically, even at a bus stop, would probably have some trouble in a conversation. You know, but we did have a lot of respect for each other as musicians, you know, and I think we were actually interested in each other because we were so different, really totally different people. And also I was somewhat in awe of Rowland because he was one of the greatest guitarists of his generation. And I suddenly was recording with him, and I was like, wow, it's a bit of luck I could not have counted on, you know. And I made my first solo album with one of the great, I mean, that's what I consider him, one of the 2 or 3 greatest guitarists of his generation. There's no question about it. You can line him up against anyone. He's right there in the top 5. I can't even think of who would actually be better than him or as good as him, really. It was phenomenal, you know.
Who would you bring out of the top 5?
Of his generation? I don't really know. I'd have to think too hard at the moment. It depends what style, really. Some of them were technically great, but were phenomenal for their style. That's the punk thing more. I love the Replacement sound. That's the closest I could come to someone else I would consider very, 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 the Stinsons, you know, Tommy Stinson and Bob Stinson and Westerberg. Yeah, you know, Rowland and I got on okay. I remember arriving at the studio. It was a beautiful Indian summer day in the autumn of '86, and Nikki and Rowland were there. They were having some ridiculous discussion about whether or not Nikki could call Rowland mate, which I found very endearing. And Rowland was joking about his father, and we were like, we got on okay. But we're very, very strange. He's a very strange person in many ways, Rowland. And this may have been said before, perhaps not. And we went in the studio, and they'd cooked up this backing track for the song called Gallery Wharf, the song of Nikki's, which I was going to sing. And I just walked in, and they played it on these it was a big studio, enormous speakers. It was absolutely overwhelming. It was so beautiful, you know. And then I went on and did my vocals, and it was great. We did some phenomenal work there, actually. Mostly, a lot of it was spontaneous or very little rehearsed. One song I remember, we finished one track, and Rowland and Nikki said, "What will she play?" I said, "Just play the last track backwards." I said, "Okay." Sounds great on the record, because it has this wonderful kind of flow. Nobody ever knew why. But that's it, playing things backwards. We did another track later where I said, play Folsom Prison Blues backwards, and it worked great as a truck driving song, so why waste time? The idea that you're going to play anything new in rock music is asinine. I say, just enjoy the performance, let someone else write the song. But yeah, working with Rowland was great. Those first 2 sessions we did at Woodworm. And we did some really good stuff. We did a lot of songs, actually, some of which went on to a mini album later. Remember Mini Album? And I remember that at that point, Rowland liked the line of mine he liked the most, I'd stolen from a French philosopher, which I never told him, but yeah, it just goes to show helps to do research. So he was very respectful of that line. Yeah, it's a good line. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Why do we end up so far from where we begin? But yeah, his work was beautiful. But then it was all fantastic. It was like a dream working with these people. I mean, they were phenomenal musicians, you know. And I had a lot of arguments with Nikki, but Nikki was very stubborn about everything. It was something I wasn't happy with. We had 2 hours arguing and ended up doing it his way, of course, you know. And now I realize after 25 years, what was I whining about? It was childish, you know. Genevieve was there off and on, I remember that. The only time Nikki's father ever came into a studio or saw Nikki live was for the playback of the song Gallery Wharf, which Nikki always talked about. So I gave Jeremy my best song, which I have to agree is true, thank God. Rowland did some acoustic bass, which was wonderful, and some acoustic. Oh yeah, so we co-wrote these songs. That album came out to some really good reviews and quite good sales. And then we had 6 more tracks we finished at this horrible little studio, well, actually we finished Buffalo Bill there. The first album was called I Knew Buffalo Bill, and Burning Skulls Rise, which Rowland did with Lydia Lunch later. We did in these 2 studios. One was in London. They did more country and western stuff, including the truck driving song, which Harry Howard played on. To his great credit, did it very well. And I mean, a lot of funny things. I mean, Rowland was one of those characters. I mean, I didn't know him all that well. We did a few gigs, which were fine, but I mean, we played one gig and like these two people at the front just were shouting shivers the entire time, which annoyed him no end. And he was very grumpy, but he still played brilliantly. And I had all kinds of great plans for playing live and stuff. It just wasn't easy to hold together. And I didn't really hear from him for quite a while. I do remember one very funny thing that happened. The one time he came to my house where I was living in Islington, and with Nikki, and of course after 20 minutes, I remember that 20 minutes I got a phone call and had to leave and never came back. In that 20 minutes, my ex-wife came down, who was a very prim type, bless her, and took one look at Rowland, and it made this expression of like, oh dear, and went up again, went upstairs again, sort of like, oh no, we don't want those sort of people in the house. And that was really funny. She was probably right, actually. He looked pretty wasted. And,
very vampire-like.
Exactly. It was like white and kind of like, you know, sleepy vampire look. Very hip later on with the young people. And then one time, next time I saw him years later, I was walking along in town, and he came out of the tube, and he said, "Oh, I just stole your book from some shop." He just gone and I don't know if he meant it, but I had a novel published which he'd read, which is nice. And then one day he phoned me out of the blue and said, "Oh, you're going to make some money because I've just covered the song we wrote with Lydia." Oh, actually, I didn't write it with him, but I'd written it. He liked so much with Lydia. And I was like, yeah, I was already thrilled, you know.
Remember what song?
Burning Skulls Rise, it's called. It's on Shotgun Wedding, the live thing. And then, yeah, I can run on if you like, but about Rowland.
I was just going to backtrack just in
Yeah.
with Rowland. Did you ever discuss any of his literary influences or influences like this? Or
I think I was aware of them, you see, more. I mean, I didn't have a lot of conversations with Rowland because we just weren't, it wasn't like that. We worked together, we rehearsed together, we had meals together, we hung out a bit. We must have talked, of course, at that time. I mean, we both read a lot. We would have, I just can't remember. I know he read a lot of science fiction. I remember that, Philip K. Dick and stuff. The best Rowland anecdote I can offer, we were rehearsing for this gig we did, and he said, "What should I play?" And I said, "Just play some of your wacky guitar." And he said, "If you ever call my guitar playing wacky again, I'll impale your daughter's head on my machine heads." And that was Rowland. Witty, endearing, warm. It was a brilliant thing to say. I'll never forget. It was very funny. I mean, it didn't bother me. I just thought it was hilarious. But he was like, hey, that expression, that perpetual sneer he had as he said it, you know. So I was insulted by one of the world's great guitarists, so I can die happy. But literary stuff, yeah, we would have talked. I know he liked science fiction. That's all I can remember. But he must have been very well read. He was obviously a very cultured person, you know. You could see that. Like I said, it wasn't really that sort of thing.
Sure. What was your impression of all?
I endured it, yes. Someone said about the Germans are to be endured, not enjoyed. Okay, I love Lydia Lunch. Well, I wouldn't want to be accused of that. I respect her work, especially Suicide Ocean, one of the greatest songs ever written. I love Suicide Ocean. I saw her, in '83, she opened for the birthday party at the venue that Virgin owned, where I saw some of the greatest gigs of my life. The greatest non-gigs of my life, like Alan Vega and the birthday party, anti-gigs. She came out. I've often said, you know, there's things that actually cure a headache. She can give you one. If you didn't have a headache, we were guaranteed like half an hour to induce one. There was this grotesque shrieking and them hammering away. And I was like, I mean, thank God I was on the guest list. I don't pay for such a thing. Later on, I discovered some of her spoken word stuff and some of her musical stuff. It was fantastic. But at that time, it was just kind of like, New York, you know, oy vey, you know, I don't know, you know. It was okay, and then they came on and they were brilliant, and you know, it was very nice. They played, I mean, and she did say Rowland was the greatest guitarist at the time alive, and I think she was right. And the stuff he did, I mean, the version they did of my song, I absolutely love, and I'm very proud they covered it. I think Lydia is a brilliant person, and she's literally and figuratively. Some of her work's phenomenal. But like a lot, she comes from the kind of beat generation. A lot of us very indulgent, bless her. And I couldn't listen to a lot. But you can say the same about Burroughs, and he's no dope. But I think she's brilliant. I think it was great they teamed up, and Rowland did, you know, some Velvet Morning and stuff with her, and she was really on her game then. That's the best stuff she did. It was kind of like a precursor to These Immortal Souls in a way, which was, I think, a phenomenal band. Made crime look, even though they were brilliant, actually, you know, less so. But yeah, I like her. Yeah.
Did you see These Immortal Souls?
Yeah, I saw them too early on again. Because I was kind of on the circuit of people who knew it was happening all the time. I just, you know, Rowland's got a new band, must go and see it. Plus Epic was in it, who I used to see from time to time as a friend and stuff. And I mean, Nikki was never around, he was always touring. He might have already been living in Berlin even then, actually. They were amazing. I mean, you know, what can you say? Now that, more than Crime, they should have been a big band. Now they didn't stand much chance because of the way bands work in terms of, you know, what works with the public. But I just think they were just King of California. I mean, good God, what a sound! It's remarkable. That is like, you know, that kind of country and western Lee Hazelwood thing on acid. I mean, it's just these huge. I think Rowland does these huge, strident chords and kind of it's demented almost. It's so brilliant. And the lyrics, his lyrics are phenomenal on that album, and so it proved on, you know, on Dead Radio and all that sort of stuff. And then Pop Crimes. I mean, the guy's lyrics are unique. It's just a shame that for one reason or another he didn't do more consistently for years the way Nick Cave has. I mean, I consider him he's easily as great an artist as Nick Cave. He's just relatively undiscovered and he doesn't have a big enough body of work. But I think These Immortal Souls are phenomenal. I mean, their sound was just fantastic. But look at the musician. I mean, epic again. I mean, Christ, he's an amazing drummer. Got Roland on guitar. I mean, it's just, what do you expect? You know, it's just a shame they didn't do more, but there it is. Yeah.
Or lack of motivation or anything like that?
I didn't know him well enough to say. I mean, he obviously was a very complex, it's like a TV treatment for a film, a complex person. But he never struck me at that time as being like troubled or depressed or unhappy. I think, it's like I said once in an early interview, we have a drug problem, we can't get any drugs. I mean that could have been part of it.
Reliable?
No. I remember I have a vivid memory of one time when I was meant to meet him for something and I had to go and track him down to his extremely filmically squalid bedsit somewhere in the middle of London where he was with Genevieve and it's like, you know, living like, not in a wardrobe, but almost in a wardrobe and kind of like obviously just quite indisposed and kind of like, I was like, you know, and I was always I'm very punctual. It's a curse being in the music industry. And like he was all, then I realized this is the way it is, you know, so, you know, it's cool, you know, I waited around for hours, nothing happened, and I went away. It was fine. But yeah, he was very unreliable often, and he was quite petulant in a funny kind of way, but he was actually a really lovely person. We were just so different as people that it was hard to relate to each other. I never met anyone like him, and he never met anyone like me. Not in a musical context. I think he related more musicians to being sort of, you know, blah, 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 like Nikki kind of, you know. Whereas I'd crossed a line some time ago where I was living quite a straight life, as it were, and incorporating things. I mean, I wanted to be in a band still and do music. It didn't shake out that way, but he was far from that.
Do you hear any of your, can you point out any bands where you think, oh, they've been listening pretty well?
It's hard to say. I mean, I don't know if it's specific. Sometimes you have things that are kind of like in the collective musical unconscious, like memes, as I say now. It's like Suicide. Where is there an influence not to be found? It doesn't have to be obvious, you know? It's been from the biggest artists, like Depeche Mode, to schleps playing for 10 people with Cassiotones. I mean, it's Suicide. Birthday Party, Rowland, that sound, the whole goth thing, they did best first before it was called goth. I haven't heard one goth band that I could actually stand, but I like the Birthday Party. They also had a better dress sense and a sense of humor as well, which you can't accuse most goth bands of having. Specifically, he's had to have had an enormous influence on guitarists, because guitarists, of course, are obsessed by their musical heroes, like, you know, all musicians are and artists are by their heroes. I can't be specific, but it stands to reason. But I'd say the Birthday Party was influential for a generation of bands, as the Stooges were for bands like the Birthday Party. Well, it has to be true. And his style, I think, now, not that he's died, but possibly helped by that. But not only that, but it's going to sink in. I mean, this guy was a breed apart. Not only was he a great guitarist, but he had a style of his own. I mean, you know, this whole sort of thing of brilliant technical guitarists is great. They're so fast, they're so complex, they can do this and that. The Zappa, for one, kind of pioneered and promoted earlier on, is great, but that's not a rock and roll thing. Whereas what Roland had was that core rock and roll thing. And only is a great, like Keith Richards, he's a phenomenal stylist. Like someone said to Keith Richards, talking about XL on Main Street, said all down the line sounds like Chuck Berry. And he goes, yeah, they all do. That's rock and roll. You know, that's honest. And the birthday party, yeah, they all sound like the Stooges. And what's your point? Shouldn't they? Who would you rather they sounded like? Yes. I mean, you know, I know what I'd choose. So, you know, there it is. I think Rowland's, but he'll be known more now, almost in the manner of his beloved bluesmen and stuff, as a very unusual, unique, and special artist who's overlooked by many, but he'll be discovered by many. It's early days. I mean, his body of work is just starting to be more widely understood and known, I think. I don't want to sound too pretentious, but it's true, you know, and I think... Yeah.
Well, that was some of the irony of how it all ended, is that Pop Crumbs was taking off his concert.
Yeah,
like 5 years earlier, he was playing to 10 people, and he was playing to 1,000 people at the end, like sell-out concerts. And it's like...
And with Rowland, I mean, and the whole lineage is, I mean, Jeff Lee Pierce played, of the 5 core musicians who played on I Knew Buffalo Bill, I'm the only one alive. And I'm not that old, I want to emphasize. I'm not that young either. But the point is, first Jeffrey Lee Pierce died. I can't remember exactly from, it might have been drug influence, but he died young, just sad. Then Epic died, who I actually knew much better. That really hit me very hard. Then Nikki died some years later. That really hit me hard because I was closer to Nikki. Now by the time Rowland, when Nikki died, my friend Fiona McPherson, who we all hung out with and who worked with us as musicians in London, rang me out of the blue, and actually I'd already seen, I think I already knew, and she phoned me and said, oh, you know, about Nikki, because she was upset. We were all very close for a couple of years, you know. And we talked about it, and she said, you want to tell Rowland, because, you know, you worked together on the album, and, you know, he'll want to hear it from you. I said, okay. I hadn't spoken to Rowland for about 20 years, literally, now, you know. And because, you know, he'd gone back to Australia, and, you know, and I just, I'd written him at one point, actually, and said, did he want to collaborate on some songs? And he said yes, but then he just never got back to me. And he had other things to deal with, like his health probably and stuff, you know. But I rang him out of the blue, and I said, like, oh, Rowland, you know, it's kind of awkward. He was very, very warm immediately before I said anything. I said, oh, it's Jeremy. I said, yeah. I said, I have to tell you, Nikki's died yesterday in New York. And he was really, really devastated. I mean, you know, I was in a degree of shock myself. And almost the first thing he said, which occurred to me, because Nikki's parents, who were lovely and we both knew quite well, had 2 sons who were both now had died very young. Never had any grandchildren, you know, and well, it's a human thing. And Rowland said almost immediately, I remember he just said, oh, both sons. And I said, yeah, it's awful. So we had quite a long chat. And he was very, you know, we were both really shaken up, you know, it was very sad. We both loved Nikki. He was another, you know, irreplaceable, unique person, you know. And Rowland had been very close to him for a long time when they were both living in London, you know. So then we have the chat, so he sort of devolves into something else, and I ended up saying, oh, you know, keep in touch, and maybe we could do something and this and that. And he was like, oh yeah, you know, and I called him one more time, I remember, just to deal with Nikki again, because I think I'd spoken to his parents and this and that. And then I really, you know, not that I thought no more of it, but, you know, that was that, you know. And Rowland wasn't very good at keeping in touch. I'm not saying, but, you know, email he didn't really do. And, you know, you don't expect people to write a letter these days and stuff. And, you know, like I said, he was ill. I knew he was ill. But I didn't hear much about him. And then I was in touch with Mick Harvey. He did a remix for me of some electronic thing I did to a mutual friend, nothing to do with Rowland. And I found out Rowland really was ill. Like I said, how is he? You know, give him my regards. I knew they were working together, you know. He said, oh yeah, he says hello, and you know, this and that, and he sent me some nice things Rowland had said. And I saw an interview with Rowland. Was it an interview I saw? No, an interview published in Bucketful of Brains, which I have doings with. And he said some very kind things about the work we'd done together. And I'd never really known, because it was so awkward between us when we did this stuff, what he really thought of it, really. But he did think it was good, and he enjoyed it, and, you know, the mutual respect was still there, which made me happy, you know. And then doubly so, actually, you know, after he died. This interview was published just after he died. It hadn't been published when he was still alive. And when I found out Rowland died, I mean, the date anyway, I mean, I don't know what I felt. I sort of felt, well, I felt I'm the last one. You know, Nikki, Epic, Rowland, and Jeffrey D. Pierce have all died, and I'm the last one. And I felt, and I'm not being corny, and I don't do as much music as I'd like to, but I really felt I have to keep on doing stuff. I'm doing it for them, and I've always felt this since Epic died. Then even more so with Nikki. Then really with Rowland, and I keep doing it because someone's got to keep doing all this stuff. And whenever you play, you're playing for all of them because somewhere, it's like Nikki said to me when Epic died. I said, you know, how's it going? He's like, oh, he went to the studio the day after he found out Epic was dead. And a lot of people went in the studio. But I thought, brilliant. And he said, yeah, he was there the whole time. I said, yeah, I know. I bet he was, you know. And I could feel it with Rowland. I just thought, just start doing more music all the time. And I'm very happy to say that actually this week, I Know Buffalo Bill is reissued on double vinyl deluxe edition by a Spanish label. And I'm putting a band together to go out and start playing it again. Because the thing with these people is, someone's got to keep playing. And I think Rowland, all of them I was so incredibly lucky. I mean, I'm aware I have some talent, but I mean, you know, these were phenomenally talented people. And to have just had this album dropped in my lap, which since it was released has become quite a big, well-regarded cult album. You know, the first alternative supergroup, I find quite funny. But in a way it was. And it also was almost the first alt-country album. And how did that happen? It's me and Nikki going, oh, I love Johnny Cash. Oh, I love Johnny Cash. I love Jerry Lee Lewis. I love Jerry Lee Lewis. Let's play music like them, you know. And they bring in Rowland with this sort of demi-mon kind of, you know, Lee Hazelwood kind of in the tar pit routine, you know, and it's magic. So I mean, when I found out Rowland died, it did shake me up. It's funny how these things happen. Because when I found out, it was kind of like, you know, Greg Shaw was like, had also died. All these people I'd worked with, I loved, I'd known, you know, all dying. And I thought, I'm glad I've been so healthy, but I also thought, I don't know, it's very lucky to have worked with them, and it's not sad, that's trite, it's what it is. People die, some will die younger. But it did shake me up a few days later after Rowland died, and I wrote a kind of a remembrance of him for this bucket full of brain. And I said, like, you know, what can be said about Rowland? He was unique, and what a great thing to be able to say. I ran out of things to say myself, except that he was completely unique. I mean, I'd never known anyone else like him as a musician, a person, anything. He was really, as Monty Python said, something other than else.
What would you say?
Probably say I love you, and I love your music more than anything. Love takes many forms. Tremendous respect for Rowland. Great affection for the little I knew him, because he was, I mean, I love people like that, a character, you know, that's what I call a character. Someone who's interesting and you know, and just, yeah, everything's fine. Whatever you're doing now, it's okay too. But, you know, he was a wonderful man. Mm.
Would you consider him a tragic romantic figure?
I wouldn't want to curse someone with, like, his life stands for itself. He was a great musician figure. He was a great lyricist figure. He was a great singer figure, even though he didn't realize it himself, probably. He was an original, and in this life, to be a real original is at a premium, real big premium. I mean, you know, everyone, you know, in pop music is different. Yeah, we all know about that. Like Coke bottles coming off a conveyor belt. He's the one that fell off and broke, that no one talks about much. You know, so I mean, that's actually interesting. I don't relate to tragic romantic. It's too easy. I just think he was Rowland Howard, and once you investigate what that means, you know what you know. You know all about what you have to know. He was actually a brilliant, brilliant musician, and as a musician myself, that to me is the outstanding thing. It means something else to his family, obviously, and stuff, like Nikki, you know. Like, to me, Nikki was a phenomenal person, and a great character, and a great musician. Well, there's worse ways to be remembered.
Almost finished with this.
I'd love to know what other people say about this before I venture. No. There was something there. I mean, Nick had that thing. When I saw the birthday party, when they were getting big, I mean, you know, getting into bigger venues in London, he had like girls screaming, like Nick Mania. And he'd come on and say, oh, don't do that. But obviously he was thinking, this is great. I mean, you know, that's rock and roll. Only a fool would, you know, turn themselves away from screaming girls. I think Rowland was like the other side of that coin. Not that he was, you know, less or something to do with Nick the rest of his life, but it was a different kind of sexuality, whatever it was. Maybe one beyond my ken, possibly, but obviously attractive to some. He certainly had something that, you know, it's one of those things. to me, I found it very difficult in some ways to relate to him and kind of find a way in to kind of, to us have a mutual understanding. Someone else, whoever it is, would find it instantaneous and effortless. And I mean, to him, that would probably, to them, that would all open up. But I just thought he was exceedingly strange, very unusual, you know. He had a phenomenal face. I mean, you know, he could have been a great actor. It was like Klaus Kinski or something. I mean, one in a million faces. Somewhat wasted in rock music, but great.
Do you get the impression he was having an affair with Lydia Ladd?
I assumed they, yeah, I assumed they did. That's what I always assumed, just from what I knew, from what I inferred.
Nick Cave said with Lydia, you don't have a choice.
Yeah, that's what I've heard. I mean, she's supposed to be quite predatory, but I mean, that's what her whole thing is about. I love in Suicide Ocean, different men in the same position. That's not your sort of average Alicia Keys lyric, let's face it. So I think, yeah, probably maybe it is at this point. What do I know about Alicia Keys? But yeah, I assume so. I mean, there's no shame in that. I don't know anyone who knew her who didn't have some sort of something like that with her. I never met her myself, incidentally.
I mean, women did like him, but he did seem, he wasn't doing the Nick. I mean, Nick definitely had many affairs and things, but it sort of seemed to be on a more cerebral level.
I think he was quite diffident, which is a word we don't hear often. That's what struck me. But he had that whole persona of like the kind of, you know, he's very, almost from another century. That's probably why him and Nikki hit it off so much, you know, as friends in a way. They both had this kind of out of time, out of place thing. He was very diffident, and he, you know, you could see he was quite inner, you know, yeah. We emphasize it too much. To me, he seemed very strange, but that's what was interesting, you know. It was like, and then the thing with me, then he would play guitar, and it was like just something phenomenal, and just like it was privileged to witness and hear and be part of. And he knew, I think he knew, like he was a brilliant guitarist. It may think a strange thing to say off the top of my head, but I'm sure he must have realized, you know, so many are mediocre. The whole thing with him and Nick, I don't really know. I don't know enough about Nick's music even, which may sound strange. You know, he's greatly admired and very successful, but I haven't listened to much of it. Because I just don't find it, I found it a bit too obvious. Whereas that's why I love Rowland's stuff. Like when you listen to Rowland's stuff, it is very cerebral. You know, in a way, maybe he would have been better off. He could have gone to New York, like Epic tried to do, and hung out with all these people who loved him and admired him, and were his more natural kind of, and people were influenced by him, like Sonic Youth and stuff, for heaven's sake, and had a more of a career, if only just playing every week at, like, filling clubs in New York, instead of sort of, you know, hanging out in London and waiting all the time and waiting. That game doesn't do you any good, you know, but it wasn't to be, sadly. You know. Who knows?
Is there anything you missed out on?
To do with Rowland? Not really. I mean, all the stuff about when Nikki died and when Rowland died pretty much wraps it up, I think. I can't think of
I'm not sure the timeline, but did Epic and Nikki, I mean, died way after you finished recording?
So, yeah, okay, I'll put it in perspective. Buffalo Bill and the other album was like 87, 88, they were released. Exactly when did Epic die? It was the late 90s. I hadn't lived in Swansea long. It was about 96. And then Nikki died about 3 years ago in the spring. Yeah.
And just going through the, do you have any idea why Epic died?
Epic. Oh, well, all that I know is what everyone knows, that after 10 days, Nikki had been trying to, or people have been trying to get in touch with him, notably Nikki, who did worry about him, because he was depressive and he was on medication on and off and stuff. Very fragile. Brilliant, very talented. I mean, like his solo work now is becoming very well known as being quite genius. Anyhow, Nikki hadn't heard from him for about 10 days. The landlord broke down the door, and he'd been in there, sadly, for like 10 days. He was dead. And there was an inquest, and they came up with misadventure, and that no more was said. There was murmurings about suicide, but I think those died down, and also no one wanted to put that on his poor parents, you know. And then Nikki dying, that was because of an enlarged heart, which I always thought was ironic, because Nikki always wrote endless love songs, very romantic love songs. He died of an enlarged heart. Some people said that had a drug aspect, but I just chose to turn a blind eye, because even if it did, I don't want to think of these people, they were drug casualties. I want to think of them as the people I knew, whether they took drugs or not. There was much more to them. You know, whatever I think of drugs, I mean, that's not the point. It's about them. Yeah.
And how did you hear about Rowland's death?
Well, this woman, Fiona McPherson, called me, who'd managed us briefly in London, like about late 80s. She lives in Melbourne now. You know, we kept in touch. She used to call me quite frequently, bless her, just to like, chew the fat, really. And she'd seen Rowland play some of his comeback gigs and knew about the album, and everyone was buzzing, because he'd gotten it together again. Felt well enough, I mean. And yeah, I think I knew. I read about it on the wires, and then she rang me sort of almost immediately, and I was actually quite. I just thought, out of 4 or 5 of us, I'm the one. I'm surviving at my age. That's just a testament to a lot of things: drugs, destiny, whatever, tragedy. If you want to, that's tragic, But I don't mean Rowland was tragic, but just that young, And I just thought. I didn't feel much for about a day. I wrote my obituary straight away, because you do when you're kind of like, it's like a mania type thing. I'm going to write this. I was happy with that. I sent it off. I sat there. And, and the next day it really hit me. I just really felt very, very, very much the impact of it. And that, this person I'd done things with, and I actually, in my own way, even though I didn't know him that well, I don't make any pretense of ever being close to Rowland. But also, when you work with people musically, you do have a kind of bond. It's artistic. It sounds pretentious, but I know it's true. It's a quality, not quantity equation. And even though we did a great album together, he's someone I really admired as a musician, who I feel really grateful to have worked with. And it's a part of my life that I really treasure, and those are always at a premium. So I just felt, I wouldn't feel sad. I just felt, yeah, it's Rowland, shame. And just what a pity that he could have done so much more great work, and he hadn't done as much as he could have. And then you let it go, and you think, well, I just think now, like, this album's come out, been reissued, which is great. And so my connection with him, which I'm proud of, lives on. And I'll form more bands and play more of the songs we did. And whenever I get a chance, I talk about him. Yeah, he enriched my life knowing him. I mean, when I first saw, it's one of those things, when I first saw the birthday party, and I was thinking, fucking Guitarist is weird. I mean, let's not put too fine a point on it. He's a genius guitarist, but he's also very strange, possibly troubled. Because it wasn't Nick I was looking at so much. I was just looking at the rest of them, especially Rowland, thinking, what's going on in the mind of someone who dresses like that and smokes a cigarette and plays guitar like that behind a loony like that? If someone told me, oh yeah, like in 4 years you're going to make a classic cult album with that guitarist, I would have thought, yeah, right, okay, fine, yeah.
Great point to end on.
Yeah.